Welcome back to The Wandering Naturalist. This is Angela, she, her.
And this is Brandon, he, him.
Welcome back as we talk about fishers. As I mentioned, this is a mammal that I have just been getting to know as we've been documenting it in the parks. Finally got to prove our senior manager wrong, that we did see them, that they are here. And to help us discuss that a little bit more about why we're seeing them in the metro and what's being done in the parks and elsewhere in the state to look at fishers, we have with us Dr. Michael Joyce. So you were previously on episode, I'm glad that Brandon wrote this down because I would have no idea. Episode 182 for anyone wanting to go back because you joined us to talk about flying squirrels. So welcome back. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks so much. It's great to be back. My name is Michael Joyce, he, him. I am a wildlife ecologist who works at the Natural Resources Research Institute at the University of Minnesota. It's a mouthful.
NRRI, right?
NRRI for short. And I've been there since about 2011 when I started as a master's student. The plan, as my wife and I reminisce on quite a bit, was to do a master's and then get a job. They couldn't get rid of me. I did my PhD, and then I was able to continue on there as a researcher. And so my lab is broadly interested in the ecology, conservation, and management of wildlife, particularly mammals. We do a lot of work on fishers, martins, and other carnivores. But we also do work on other things too, other mammals like flying squirrels, weasels, smaller weasels, other things. And so we sort of have an unofficial motto that we will study any mammal or other wildlife potentially that we think there's an interesting question to answer and that we can convince someone to fund the work. So we're very broadly interested. A lot of the themes we look at are things like spatial ecology, species interaction. So we do a lot of capturing, collaring, and tracking various species, and really aimed at both basic and applied questions. Where do they go? Why do they go there? How do they interact with other species, with the landscape? How does human modification of that landscape through things like forest management, development, urban sprawl, how do those things influence what these species need, how they get them, the behaviors they use to get them? And really a lot of that is driven, NRRI is an applied research institute, is, a lot of our product and impact comes by answering questions and giving data to managers so they can make informed decisions.
Yeah, and that's where it comes into play with Three Rivers here. And I'm guessing studying fishers, I'm going to ask flying squirrels, fishers.
They both start with an F.
There you go.
So you study F animals is what you're saying.
Yeah, that's right.
And everybody's assigned a letter of the alphabet, and that was
work your way down.
Well, and I think that's a good example. We think there's really important and interesting questions to be answered about flying squirrels and fishers. Fishers prey on flying squirrels. Many other species prey on them as well. But here, it's a situation where we have some really key questions about flying squirrels and what their future might look like in Minnesota. We have similar questions about fishers. What unifies the different species we study is having an important knowledge gap that we think needs to be filled to, again, both to meet some of our basic understanding of the species, but also then can go to wildlife and land managers, policymakers, so that they can make informed decisions that best balance, for example, with some of the carnivore work, human economic activities in our forests and sort of the ecological function of our forests. So we're all about trying to find that balance. We can't just manage for economics. We can't, even though sometimes I'd like to, just manage for wildlife conservation, but we need to do a good job of getting what we need, leaving what other species need so that we can have robust wildlife populations and natural communities.
I imagine flying squirrels and fishers, another thing they would have in common is the importance of trees and cavities. Is that kind of like an underlying thing? So what else? Why study the fishers? Like what specifically are you looking for in studying about fishers?
Well, this is maybe a biased opinion, but fishers are just really cool animals. And there's nothing scientific about it. They're just really captivating, really cool species. And so like many of our carnivores and other mammals, they're secretive and they live at relatively low densities. And so we don't get to directly observe them a lot. And I think anyone who's had the opportunity to see a fisher in the wild, that's a great day. You're going to remember that when you get a glimpse of one, when you see what they're doing. But part of it is learning what they're doing. seeing how they're using the landscape. Because we don't get a glimpse of them, there's a lot of questions we'd like to know that are really important from a research perspective. So feeding that natural curiosity, it's maybe not what my funders want me to start with, but it is really important. There's a lot of personal satisfaction with studying fishers. Their history in Minnesota and elsewhere, they are sensitive to the way we manage forests, the way we manage our landscapes. They can be sensitive to harvest from fur trappers. And so there are species that we really do need to pay attention to make sure, again, that we can find strategies to balance how we're treating them, how we're treating the landscape so that they can be viable. They are one of our native carnivores in Minnesota. They hold a lot of intrinsic value to a wide range of the public, from trappers who want opportunities to continue to harvest them to people that have no interest in harvesting them, but just have a lot of deep value knowing that they're doing well and that they're living in Minnesota. There's that intrinsic value, but a lot of it too is, we're starting to find, and we're just on the cusp of some of this, that they play really important roles in our forest ecosystems. So despite what a lot of people think with predators, they don't typically live at a high enough density to affect their prey community population sizes. But the way they interact with prey is still really important to drive prey behavior, to shuttle nutrients around. They function as prey to larger predators, which we can talk a little bit more about in a second. And so how they're interacting with other predators is really interesting and important. But one of the things we're uncovering recently with some work that we've done is that they play a really critical and underappreciated role dispersing seeds, which we've known for a while, but also spores of mycorrhizal fungi.
Oh, I saw that talk. I saw that talk you gave, and I was like, I would have never thought like the fungi movement and poop were so critical to look at.
And when we look across our carnivores in Minnesota, fishers move really long distances for their size. They eat a lot of fungivorous prey. So things like redback voles and squirrels that are eating these fungi. And so compared to other carnivores, they have about a 2.5 times more effectiveness in dispersing spores in the landscape. Is some of what we're finding.
So they're not necessarily eating mushrooms then. They're eating the animals that eat mushrooms, and that's how they're getting the spores.
I was also just making the connection. This is another F word, Michael. Fungi.
It is,
You might have a problem.
Fishers, fungi, flying spores, we might have a problem. They might eat some fungi as well. And there are some studies in California where they have found sporocarps, the fruiting bodies of fungi, in their GI tract. So they do eat some fungi as well. But what we found, and we've seen some coyote and red fox that also are seemingly eating fungi directly, but most of the spores that we're documenting are coming through small mammals because, the scats that have the small mammal remains in them have way more spores. They have the exact same fungal communities that the small mammal consumers have. And a lot of the species attacks that we're identifying are way too small to be of nutritive value to fisher.
Well, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think I remember being taught that redback voles are a critical animal for restoring forests to what were used to be beaver ponds and become beaver fields because they need that mycorrhizal fungi. And redback moles are one of the ones that bring it back, but they only burrow maybe a couple of feet from the forest a year.
Yeah,
and
not moving.
Fisher speed that process up because they might be more likely to go farther into those fields.
Yeah, and that's where fishers and other carnivores are really critically important, is that they, some of the fragmentation boundaries that small mammal fungal consumers can't cross, carnivores can. And so reinitiating, getting fungal spores back into regenerating forests is really important, beaver meadows, things like that. But also just improving genetic diversity of existing fungi by being able to move them farther. Again, this is something that we're just really uncovering now.
That's amazing. They're like, aside from the diversity, but helping to do that forest cycling of habitat.
They're like the Uber drivers.
That's what we normally think of predators about, I think.
They're like the Uber drivers, moving them out further. That's
another example of what you can learn by digging through another animal's poop.
So I'm guessing that's how you do it, right? You're just going out and collecting samples. How do you know it's fisher scat?
So we either get it directly from a fisher or we genetically identify them.
Interesting. Yep. How else are you studying fishers? Because I know you've got some like we were just chatting a little bit ago, like you've got one in the trap right now. How does one study fishers?
Yeah, so we are doing some work in the Twin Cities metro and south of there, really trying to understand. So we've known since at least 2005 that fishers have come back into this area. A lot of our early knowledge of fishers moving back to this area was by public sightings that the public shared with us. We were able to verify trail camera images, road kills, incidentally trapped fishers. And so we've seen those sightings increase over time. It's tempting to look at that and say, well, the population is really exploding, and that might be true. But also, more people have cameras, more people know we want sightings. That's part of it as well. And so we really started this research to learn better about, we see some sightings in areas that seem really unlikely that fishers could live there. They're probably dispersing through. And so we really wanted to do, number one, a systematic camera survey so that we're not just relying on random sightings from the public, which are really valuable in helping us know where fishers are, but to get more scientifically valuable information, go out and put cameras with a scientific design, see where they're at, see where areas are that we have fishers detected every year, where some of the parks in the metros, we seem to have a fisher who will establish a home range, live there for a few years. If they die or move, it'll be vacant for a little bit of time after that. And then the other thing, which again, back to that curiosity and really getting that glimpse into the world from the eyes of a fisher, live trapping fishers, putting GPS collars, and then following them and getting as much information we can. Where do they go? Why are they going there? What are they eating? What are their vital rates? How are they surviving? What sort of causes of mortality? How's their reproduction and litter size compared to other populations? So really trying to answer a lot of those questions. And so the tools we use, again, are trapping, radio telemetry, GPS collars. We can see things like some of the fishers in the parks in the metro are crossing busy roads very frequently. There's risk there, but I always say with road crossing, my kids have basically got to the point now where they don't have risk crossing the road because they know to stop and look both ways and not go if there's a car there. Fishers can do things like find culverts to go under busy roads. They can also be aware and be vigilant and look for vehicles, be active at night, things like that. So this is how we're studying them and sort of some of the questions and the information we're trying to fill in.
It seems like there's maybe moving their way south, at least maybe they're reclaiming habitat they used to have, or maybe they're not finding as much food up north. Do you have any thoughts on why they are starting to move south and any challenges they might face not being in the coniferous forests?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And we talk about this a lot. I can't give you a firm answer, but I can give you some of the things that we think are going on. First of all, in the late early 1900s, it's considered extirpated that we removed fishers from Minnesota. They still existed in some of the areas that humans didn't touch, but that was driven by large-scale forest removal, some of it permanent, some of it temporary. Those forests regenerated, and some of it was from unregulated harvest. And so since that time, they started coming back mid-1900s. They were back enough that the DNR reinstituted a harvest season in 1977. We saw that population go up and peak in the late 90s and then come down by about half till the 2010s, 2015 or so. And part of it is they recovered. They don't reproduce really fast for a species their age, and it just takes them a while to reclaim the existing habitat or recovered habitat that was there from the time of extirpation. What's interesting is what you usually see with some of these population expansions is there's a core population that's doing really well. There's not space for everyone. And then you get movement out into the peripheral range. That's not what we're seeing because, again, this expansion has coincided with a pretty big population decline in what was formerly their core range in north central, northeastern Minnesota. But they've moved all the way out to North Dakota. There's now population there. They've moved out to like Otter Tail County, down into the metro, and all the way down to Houston County. So probably a lot of it is just having the opportunity for the population grow to the point that dispersers could move and recolonize existing habitat. But we don't fully understand, for example, is this northern Minnesota fishers that have moved in? Or we've seen a similar expansion in Wisconsin. Are they crossing the Mississippi River? Is it mostly from Minnesota, mostly from Wisconsin, some from each? These are some of the questions that we'd really like to explore in the future. And then in terms of risk, what we see a lot with carnivores moving back into human dominated areas is that it's basically a great risk, great reward situation. The way that humans use the landscape, certain prey and food sources are really abundant. Garbage, gray squirrels, cottontails. Some of these prey are really abundant, and there can be a really good prey landscape for a species like fishers. But there's also risk. There's vehicle mortality as they're crossing these busy roads. There's interactions with pets. There's other carnivores like coyotes that are coming back in, and if they're mutually avoiding people, they may interact with each other and have predation consequences of moving back into this landscape. They may have to cross a lot more bad habitat to get to the patches of good habitat. So these are some of the things, there's more raccoons in southern Minnesota than northern. Maybe there's raccoon associated diseases that they get exposed to a lot more. There's a lot of potential, and we're trying to dig into as much of that as we can. Sadly, I'm not to the point to have a lot of firm conclusions on that.
Early on. What has been some of your surprises so far in working in the parks? And I know you had a collared male that vanished and was never to be found again, because males have giant home ranges from my understanding they both do, male and female, but the male especially can wander pretty far.
Some of our surprises, we knew fishers would be eating squirrels. I've still been surprised at, we did not in the original study plan to take really good prey density values. That's another thing we like to follow up on. But seemingly there's a lot more gray squirrels and other squirrel prey. And so there's little shifts in the diet that, we anticipated, but it's still interesting to see. One of the surprises so far is that we'd like to expand the study for another 3 to 4 years. But so far, reproductively, they're producing as many or perhaps more kits on average in southern Minnesota than they are in the north. And females are living in a lot smaller areas, about a half or less than a half of the territory size that we see in northern Minnesota, which is an indicator that perhaps with the prey, they can fit a lot more fishers in that area. The habitat that exists might be of higher quality. But some of the surprises is some of the areas we're seeing them, if you would have asked me 5 years ago, I'd say there's no way a fisher could colonize and live in that area. And yet we've had some wildlife managers of the DNR who have accidentally found reproductive dens at small WMAs where there's basically a little bit of forest along a river. I've been surprised at the ability of fishers to navigate busy roads and successfully cross very busy roads repeatedly without getting killed. The small home ranges, one of the other fun things is in some of these parks in Dakota County, we had a female last year we were monitoring, and she produced a kit and lived in a very small home range, one of the smallest we've documented. And we were hoping there'd be a male around, and we had cameras up, we had traps up. We just never detected a male. Well, sure enough, here's mating season and a male shows up. He breeds her. Where did he come from? Where did he go to? We don't know. So there's still a lot of questions we don't know, but things like that. I mean, the extent to which coyotes are visiting reproductive dens of fishers. I think every single reproductive den we monitored last year had at least one coyote visit.
And are coyotes common predators of fisher pups? Or
of fishers in general, they can be. Okay. And we did have one of our first females we collared was killed by a coyote. Overall, what we see in northern Minnesota is a lot of bobcats visiting reproductive dens and high rates of predation. In southern Minnesota, we're seeing a lot of coyotes visiting dens, but not actually a lot of predation. So it seems like when females can be vigilant, they climb a tree, they're out of reach of a coyote. Not so with a bobcat, right? So there's some differences like that. Really, I think the biggest surprises is just where they can live. And that's one of the cool things about the project. And again, it's a basic question, but it also has applications. What are the limits on where a fisher can actually live? How much forest do they actually need?
A question I'm wondering about that, because we talked to a researcher who was studying pileated woodpeckers in the suburbs, and he was shocked that they could survive in the suburbs and how small their home range was there, but they did better. Do we have preconceived notions maybe that these animals need large home ranges and specific habitat because we are used to them being in a recovery stage where we pretty much extirpated them, they're recovering. There's less, so their home range is greater because there's not the competition between them. And now we're actually maybe starting, as their population gets bigger, seeing them in what maybe they might have been like more historically.
I think that's a tempting conclusion one could draw. What I would caution against that is that one, we're seeing these small territories in southern Minnesota that suggest greater density potential, but there's still a lot of areas that they cannot occupy. And so if that landscape was not so fragmented and so much farmland, there was more oak savanna and more forested prairie and things like that, we would be able to have more fishers there. And certainly the highest density of fishers ever measured are in large tracts of old growth forest in the Pacific Northwest. So I think it's yes and no. Where we have less optimal habitat, they need more space and they can't tolerate it as fragmented. Mm-hmm. But there's still a lot more fishers we could fit into southern Minnesota if we didn't have such a fragmented landscape. And so that's some of the nuance that, yeah, they need different things than what we maybe thought. They can live in areas that we didn't used to think they could, but it doesn't mean there's not a consequence in like vehicular mortality. The rates that we're seeing fishers die from roadkill mortality in southern Minnesota seems to be much, much, much higher than northern Minnesota. So again, this trade-off, great risk, great reward. The individuals that can go to the southeast, the driftless area where there's still good tracks and they don't have to cross roads are doing well. But in the metro, there's still a lot of risk, and you can navigate that risk for a while, but still live shorter life and produce less offspring overall than you would if you were in another area where the prey density might be not as high. So there's all these trade-offs that we need to consider with that question.
That makes sense. I just, on a personal curiosity, you said that fishers are just really cool. Do you have any favorite facts about fishers you'd want to share with our audience?
So you brought, I think in one of the earlier episodes, you talked a little bit about porcupine predation. So that's something that is always associated with fishers. And so the adaptations they have to allow them to kill porcupines are typically different than other carnivores. There are other carnivores that can and do routinely kill porcupines. Cougars or mountain lions seem to be pretty good at this. There's some studies of wolverines in the Yukon where they have really high rates of porcupine quills that suggest they're hunting them. And things like bobcats and coyotes can make it work, but very often can die from those interactions with porcupines. And so that's something with fishers that's really interesting.
You said they have some special adaptations that make them really good at killing.
Yeah, and so the approach, so they're small, they're agile, they have specific search strategies that they use where they're hunting porcupines, where they know where they live. They go to their den tree and they look for them. If they get them in a vulnerable state, they circle around them. If a porcupine, their response is going to be to hide their head somewhere. So if they start climbing or going out on a branch so that a fisher can only get the quill end, right? So their ability to climb ahead of the porcupine and turn it back down, their size, some of these behavioral adaptations seem to be different than other species and perhaps more effective.
There's a lot more strategy involved where it seems like they have really honed in on it.
Yeah. Yep.
They'd be really good at Battleship.
Yeah, that's right.
We're never going to be able to get that disassociation out. Battleship and fishers.
Yeah. Well, and this isn't so much a fun fact, but I do, if I can, want to address something we hear a lot of from the public, which is sort of a misnomer. So when we talk to the public about fishers, we almost universally, even people who think they're really cool, we hear fishers are mean, they're nasty, they'll attack people. There's all this risk to pets, especially cats. People are worried about cats and small dogs. And I always respond, I think it's really important that the public knows that fishers are different than humans. They don't live by the same rules we do. It's inappropriate to take human standards and force that on a fisher. Are they mean? If you're a squirrel that's getting hunted by a fisher, you may be able to make that argument. The reality is that a lot of people that have this notion have never seen a fisher or been close to them. Fishers don't want anything to do with humans. And I also like to say, because there have been some situations recently with not only in Minnesota, but elsewhere with fishers with rabies and other health concerns. If a fisher is approaching you, get away because there's probably something wrong with it. But in general, you're not going to see that. Fishers, if you encounter them, you might not even know it because they fled before you do. In a trap, they're not mean. They're very, they're docile. They don't want anything to do with us. Now, if you have one in a trap and you stick your finger in there, of course they're going to bite you because they're scared. But this notion that they're mean and they're killers and they're going to attack people is really overstated and doesn't really match the behavior that we see when we're doing this work very close with fishers. And so I think that's a message I always try to get out there. And with pets, can a fisher kill a domestic cat? Yes, but there's risk there. And what a lot of people don't realize is female fishers, maybe 6 pounds, 7, 8 at
There's
the most.
cats bigger than that.
Yeah, most domestic cats are bigger than that. And so that's a risk that most fishers are not going to take. If they got into a fight, could they kill a cat? Yeah, but they could also be killed by a cat.
And the cat should be inside.
Well, and that's the other thing I like to say is that I have never known a fisher that's learned how to open a door and come inside and attack your pet.
Yeah, don't invite a fisher in your house.
Yeah, so keeping cats inside, keeping watch of small dogs really removes any slight risk that might be there.
Yeah, I love that advice because I think that is something people equate. I think it's like badgers and fishers. They have that like persona that we project onto them. But I think like the elusive secretiveness would speak more to probably what people should be equating to fishers.
And I think it's a weasel thing in general because weasels can kill prey bigger than them. There's this notion that they're bloodthirsty and they're going to go and kill things and not eat them. And they're killing to survive. That's how they make a living. And again, they do things that by human standards are weird. So if you're a male and you didn't produce kits, but you mate with a female, you might benefit from killing her kits. Yeah. But that doesn't have a human corollary. Yeah. That's different. A lot of carnivores do that.
I was going to say lots of wildlife does that.
Yeah. And so it's always hard to it's problematic, I should say, to anthropomorphize and say, well, if humans did that, that'd be bad. So fishers are mean or they're nasty or they're whatnot. They're not. They're fishers and they're trying to make a living and they're trying to do the same things we are, survive, in some cases reproduce for us. In most cases for fishers, they're trying to reproduce and they're just trying to make a living and do what fishers do.
So we're near the end where we have 5 minutes left. We always like to end with this question. We probably already asked you in episode 182, but do you have any advice for listeners who are maybe really interested in the scientific field?
Yeah, so I think what I would say is the advice might change a little bit depending on whether you're in high school and looking at college, in college exploring career options, post-college, is learn as much as you can about it. So if you might be interested in a branch of science, whether that's wildlife, other forms of ecology, plant ecology, cell biology, learn about what it's like. Talk to people that do the job. See if you can shadow or volunteer. See what things are like. I actually started my scientific career as a molecular biology major, working in a cell biology and developmental biology labs. And I learned that I loved learning about that stuff. But in terms of doing the research, it was really cool, but it was hard for me. I like to study things I can see.
Yeah.
Right. And so explore. It's really important to see what those jobs are like, but also to see the challenges associated with them. I do think we're in a situation where there's been a lot of scrutiny of science, and some of it's justified, some of it isn't. I think scrutiny is always fine because it's how we prove that scientific method is really a valuable tool. Science can advance our knowledge and help,
But it's got to keep going. It doesn't end.
Yeah. But learn about science. Science is not a product. Science is a process, and it looks different in different fields. If you're really interested in wildlife or plant ecology, reach out to the DNR, reach out to universities, find people who are doing work in that and see, can you talk to them? Can you join them for a day? Can you see what that's like? A lot of scientific fields require at least a bachelor's degree. And again, that's another part of the discovery process is, I like wildlife. Do I want to be a wildlife manager? What does that career path look like?
What does it take to get there? Thank you so much, Michael, for joining us again. I am excited to hopefully get another phone call of a fisher in a trap so that I can, it's going to line up one of these times so that I can see a fisher up close and not just a we've had to, retrieve dead ones that we've gotten calls about or pictures. So I'm ready to see one up close so I can really be in awe of them further. And I'll share.
Fingers crossed. Yeah.
Fingers crossed. And I would, of course, share it on social media for everyone. So thank you for all the research you're making possible in the parks and for joining us.
Yeah, of course. And thanks so much for having me. If I could just conclude with one thing, and that's we are still very interested in fisher sightings in southern Minnesota.
Good point.
So if you see a fisher, we prefer to have an image, trail camera, cell phone, whatever. If you see a fisher, especially in a place that you don't expect it, get in touch with me. You can go to NRRI's website, search my name. You'll find my contact information. Send it on through. We'd be really thrilled to hear from you and, expand sort of the sightings and the knowledge of where fishers are.
Yeah, share them on our social media, and we'll put Michael's information on there as well. So citizen science, we're always for empowering people. So thanks for reminding us. As mentioned, we have to get a shout out to the funding that makes these research projects possible, such as with the fishers. That funding source is made possible through things like the Environmental Natural Resources Trust Fund, also known as LCCMR. So thanks for all those that got their votes in and kept that funding going. Next time we talk to Dr. Roger Powell, one of the leading experts on fishers and author of numerous professional and popular articles on members of the weasel family and other mammals.